If movement is one half of the equation, aiming is the other half. But first, let's talk about recoil. There are 4 different things that fall under the umbrella of what people call recoil in this game. First is vertical recoil. Whenever you fire your weapon, it kicks up by varying degrees, depending on which gun you're using. This is most noticeable on higher damage weapons such as the Gauss Saw or the NZ. Vertical recoil is static, meaning that it kicks up the same amount every time, with one exception that we're about to talk about. That exception being the first shot multiplier. The first round out of your weapon will always kick up more than the subsequent shots. One weapon with a severe first shot multiplier is the LA-1 Anchor, which is also an NC weapon. Third on the list is horizontal recoil. When you fire your gun, not only will it want to pull upwards, but is also going to pull to the left or the right. And some weapons, such as the MSWR for the Terran Republic, tend to go to the right more than they do to the left, resulting in a skewed recoil angle. You can see the effects of horizontal recoil on this graph. The cyan lines represent how far a weapon will kick in one direction, before self-correcting back towards the center. When you put a forward grip on your weapon, these cyan lines become much more narrow, resulting in a more stable weapon. Horizontal recoil tends to be more prevalent on weapons with high rates of fire and low damage, such as the T9 car for the Terran Republic. And finally, the most important of them all, cone of fire. Cone of fire is how far off center each shot will land. And as you fire, your cone of fire increases. The cone of fire is represented on this graph by the black circles. And it is because of this that you have the burst fire, but we'll talk about that later. Now that we've gone over basic weapon mechanics, we can start talking about aim. First up, where to aim. Planetside 2 has locational damage. If you shoot someone in the chest, they take however much damage your weapon does, minus any range penalties, like for being too far away from your target. If you shoot them in the legs, they only take 90% of the damage they normally would. And if you shoot them in the head, they take twice the damage. And I cannot overstate how big taking twice the damage is. For example, we'll use, say, an Orion, which is the default weapon for the Vanu Heavy Assault. Let's assume for simplicity's sake your target does not have an overshield, or it doesn't have nanoweave armor, or anything that would reduce the damage they take. Players have 500 health and 500 shields. If you shoot someone in the body with an Orion, that'll take 7 shots to kill them up close, which will take about half a second. But if you were to shoot them in the head, that only takes 4 shots to kill. And if you didn't miss any of those shots, that would only take 258 milliseconds. That is not very far off the average human reaction time. So landing headshots is extremely important. You're not always going to be able to get them, but it's important to try to. It can mean a world of difference in a fight, especially if you're fighting multiple opponents and you're on a time limit. Now that we know headshots are important, we have to make sure we're landing them. The most important thing we need to make sure we're doing is burst firing. Earlier we talked about cone of fire. Bursting is how you reset this cone. There is no hard and fast rule for how many shots you fire. Every weapon is different, and every time your target's range changes, the amount you need to burst changes with it. I could tell you to burst in groupings of 3 to 5, however that could be wrong. If your target's in your face, bursting isn't going to do anything for you. By the time your cone gets so bad that you're missing, well, he should already be dead. And if you're firing in larger groupings and your target is far away, your cone of fire is going to get to the point where you're shooting over his shoulder. So test your weapon, get a feel for it. The best piece of advice I can give is very simple. When you start missing, reset your burst. At first this is going to be very difficult, but over time and with more experience you'll just intuitively know when you need to reset your burst. Also keep in mind the first shot multiplier mechanic we talked about earlier. So if you're firing only a couple shots at a time, you're actually going to experience more vertical recoil than you would normally. This may or may not be a problem for you. Some weapons have very little first shot multiplier at all. Some weapons have a lot. Once again, test your weapon, get to know it. For most of your engagements, you're going to be aimed down sights. However, there are times when you're going to want to hipfire. Hipfire is very potent in this game. One reason for that is speed. When you aim down sights with your average weapon, your movement speed is halved. Some weapons have a movement speed reduction of only 25%, but the effect is still noticeable. When you're hipfiring, there's no reduction on your speed at all, and when you're up close in someone's face, that speed can save your life. If your opponent is strafing properly, and he's hipfiring, that's going to be a very hard target to hit. So you want to hipfire whenever you can really get away with it. A good way to tell if it's time to hipfire is if your reticle is tight over your opponent's player model, or if your reticle fits inside their player model. Earlier we talked about how important headshots are, but when you're hipfiring, things change a little bit. you're not necessarily going for the fastest kill possible. You're going for the fastest movement speed possible. Most of the weapons you're going to use don't have the hipfire cone to accurately land headshots. Well, unless you're practically inside of them. So, aim for the upper body. Most of your shots are going to hit the torso, but some are going to hit the head. There is an exception to that, however. Some weapons that are specifically designed with hipfire in mind, such as the submachine gun, can get away with aiming at the head during hipfire. Given what we've already talked about, you can probably imagine how deadly those are in the right hands. On the other side of the spectrum, there are guns that are really bad at hipfire. They could be bad for one or two reasons, or even both. First being a bad hipfire cone of fire. While you can put a laser sight on almost every weapon, some of them are really bad even with a laser equipped. Some weapons just have a poor damage output, like the T-32 Bull for the Terran Republic. Weapons like these can't really afford to go for body shots, at least not if you want to use them effectively. If you find yourself using something poorly suited for hipfire and have to fight in those ranges, it may be better to pull out your pistol instead. While the revolvers are the best pistols in the game, the default ones are serviceable up close, so don't be afraid to use yours if your target gets too close. A concept that's really important in shooters is something called Crosshair Placement. While it can feel really good to do a 180 and headshot someone instantly, for the most part you're going to want to try to set yourself up for the easiest shot possible. As an example, let's look at this clip from a CSGO tournament. It's a different game with entirely different mechanics, but crosshair placement is a concept that's present in every FPS game. Pay attention to where these players are putting their crosshair.
Spotted above the smoke, tagged at 12, Twists is gone, it's pretty much all on Naf at this point. He wants to get Device from a hell position, did actually realize that he overstepped the mark Device and turned back with a double take. Naf was too quick to find his head. Bomb ticking at this point. Taco has to get on it. Taco with only 12, he can be sprayed out, no smoke on it. He's down, we're down, gone. It's going to be Astralis winning it, and I say that with conviction, even though Naf finds 2 kills.
You'll notice that they're always setting themselves up for the easiest shot possible. Given how fast you can die, you want to minimize the amount of time you take to get on target. In your average Planetside base, there's a lot more places someone could possibly be than, say, a map in CSGO, but the concept is still important nonetheless. The only real way to practice this is to constantly remind yourself where someone could possibly be at any given moment. As you gain experience playing the game, this will come intuitively to you. But until then, just make sure your crosshair is always head level, and pointed in the general direction of where the enemies are coming from. Not only can you use crosshair placement for yourself, but you can also use your enemy's crosshair placement. And what I mean by that is this. Imagine that whatever opponent you're facing is competent. When he comes into a room, he's going to have his crosshair head level and in the direction he thinks you're at. If you run with this assumption, you can subvert his crosshair placement by standing in places he wouldn't expect, or changing your elevation by standing on top of a box or a railing. I can tell you from experience that it is very unpleasant to walk into a room where your opponent is standing on top of a box somewhere completely different. While the disadvantage you face in this situation is not insurmountable, it is certainly very difficult if your opponent is incompetent. A bit of a prerequisite before you can aim properly is having correct settings. That means graphics too. If your frame rate is poor, you're going to have a severe handicap at basically everything, and it isn't possible to overstate how big that handicap is. There is a world of difference between 30 FPS and 60 FPS, and beyond that, 60 to 144 is a big gap too, provided that your monitor can display those high frame rates. So if you want to be effective, it's important to have as many frames as you possibly can, even if you don't have a high refresh rate monitor. I'm not going to show you which graphical settings to change, because quite frankly, other people have already done that, and I don't think I could really add anything to that conversation that hasn't already been said. However, I will link in the description several resources to improving your frame rate. What we will be talking about, however, is mouse sensitivity and DPI. Before you start refining your aim, it's important to have a good foundation, and your sensitivity is your foundation. Before we go over sensitivity specifically, there are 3 settings we need to look at. Under the General tab in the Settings menu, there are 3 boxes. The first one we care about is Use Raw Mouse Input. This does exactly what it says on the tin. This makes it so your game takes its input directly from your mouse, rather than going through your Windows mouse sensitivity settings. For simplicity's sake, turn this on. Second is Reduce Input Lag. Turn this on as well. We talked before about how fast you can die in this game and how many different factors can slow your reaction time. You really don't want to add anything to that. Input lag is really bad. Leave this checked. And last, but certainly not least, is mouse acceleration. What this setting does is it changes your sensitivity on the fly based on how fast you're moving your mouse. For 99% of people, this is going to destroy any muscle memory you're trying to build. I have met some people who perform really well with this setting turned on, but those people know who they are, and they know how much of a mutant they are. And you're probably not one of them, so turn this setting off. Now that that's out of the way, let's move on to sensitivity. The only hard rule is that you want a low sensitivity when you aim down sights, so you can accurately track targets, among other things. If you have a high sensitivity, any tremor in your hand, any mistake you're going to make, and you will make them, is going to be punished a lot more than if your sensitivity was low. So we want to make it low as you can tolerate. But which setting is the question, because we have a lot of them to choose from. The ones we care about is mouse sensitivity and aim sensitivity. The first one controls your sensitivity when you're just walking around in hipfire stance. The second one, obviously, is for when you aim down sights. There is also scoped mouse sensitivity, which determines your sense when you're using an optic with a magnification of 3.4 times or greater, and I would recommend not using those optics unless you're sniping. So we're just going to pretend that one doesn't exist. So what values do we want these to be set to? Well, that depends based on your DPI. If you know what your DPI is, great. We can use this calculator I linked in the description to figure out what a good value is for you. First, hit the drop down and select Aim Sensitivity. Then, input your DPI and your current sensitivity, and lower it until you get to about 18 inches for a 360. You might be wondering how I got to that number, and the answer is, I pulled it out of my ass. There is no best number, only what's best for you. But when I change someone's sensitivity, I have to set it to something, and 18 inches is a good starting place. You can make your 360 much higher than that, like say 40 inches, but that necessarily wouldn't be better. Mess around, find a value that suits you. Just don't go too far in the opposite direction or run into the problems I mentioned earlier. You can do this exact same thing for your hipfire sensitivity, and I would recommend about an 8-inch 360 for hipfire. You can afford to have your hipfire sense high because you don't really need the precision you do when you aim down sights, and having a higher number makes navigating the world easier, provided you're used to it. There are some people out there who have a low hipfire sensitivity as well, or have their hipfire match their aim 1-to-1. And chances are, if you are one of those people, you don't really need my advice in this field anyway. Now on the flip side, if you don't know what your DPI is and you can't find out, I've got some bad news for you. You're gonna have to eyeball it. Find a spot on a wall, aim down sights, and do a 360 and watch how far your mouse moves. Adjust your sensitivity until you're within the range I mentioned earlier. And it doesn't have to be precise. Remember, there's no hard and fast rule, just make sure you have a low aim sensitivity. Now that that's all done, you can put your new settings into practice. But be warned, after changing your sensitivity, especially if it's a big jump, you're going to play like shit for a while. This is a muscle memory problem that can only be solved with time, so tough it up and stick with it. Otherwise, all this talk about aim is for naught. There's going to be one more video after this that goes over a couple advanced things, namely pre-firing and how to peek. So stick around for the next one if you want the full package. Alright, it's good. We're going back.
I need that on this side. I'm almost out.
Grenades are going out.
This side's really hot again.
C4 in. We have one C4 in mid.
I can't see a damn thing.
Hey, you. You're finally awake. You were trying to cross the border.